You're the first person I've ever met that's actually been on Survivor. It's pretty cool, I watch it all the time. Thank you very much, Marina, for inviting me here, and Mike for bringing me here, and John, where's John O'Mara?
I don't think he's here yet.
Okay. Now, can everybody hear me okay? Yes. If I falter or just let me know. It's great to be here, but just a little bit of housekeeping. I was speaking to a friend of mine today on Skype. She lives in Morocco, but I told her I was coming to Rhode Island. And she said, oh I've got family here. But she doesn't know their names, but apparently 3 Jewish sisters and a brother came here from Sheffield, England, sometime in the early 19th century. And one of them was called So Emma. So if anybody knows of 3 Jewish sisters that came to Rhode Island, well, not likely, but never know. Look, I just want to say thank you. I'll start. A lot of people ask me why, as a New Zealander, I should care about the internal politics of your country. And there's 2 basic reasons. The first is simple gratitude. My country is only free because of the huge sacrifice of your fathers and uncles and grandfathers in the battles of Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea and Midway during World War II.
Amen.
Amen.
Your countrymen's sacrifice saved my country from subjugation by the Japanese Imperial Army. The other reason is related, but it's a little bit more selfish. Ronald Reagan had it right. This is the last best hope for mankind. If freedom fails in the United States of America, if you lose your military superiority, freedom will fail in every corner of the globe. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Cubans, and all their crazed allies around this planet will carve up this planet amongst themselves. Now, I live way down in the bottom of the South Pacific, and a lot of New Zealanders are very cocky because they think nobody's ever going to bother us. And a lot of Americans send me emails saying, if Obama gets back in again, can we come down and live there? No. But I say, look, you love the country, it's wonderful, you're very welcome, but this is the front line now. The front line of liberty. If it fails here, there's nowhere to run. 1,500 miles to the north of my country lie the Fijian Islands. Beautiful place. They now have a Marxist government. The Chinese are training the Fijian military, building big hydroelectric dams on the islands. Fiji is now a Chinese client state. And that's happening right throughout the South Pacific. A few months ago, the Australian Defence Minister was up in China, and a top official of the Chinese Defence Department embarrassed him mightily. In public, he said to him, now is the time for Australia to choose. Do you stay under American protection, or do you come under our protection, Chinese protection? And that's the kind of protection that Tony Soprano would offer you. No, this is serious stuff, ladies and gentlemen, because of the leadership coming out of the United States, the bad guys of the world are getting bolder and bolder. And your allies all over this planet, from Israel to Britain to Australia to New Zealand, are, to put it bluntly, freaking out. Because we've relied on your protection for a long time, and now we're worried. We saw what happened in Eastern Europe over the missile defences in Poland and Czechoslovakia, just given away in favour of the Russians. Those countries were betrayed, and we're wondering what's going to happen next. So this is causing a lot of instability around the planet, and this is why I'm here, because this is not just you guys. What happens here is going to affect every free nation across this globe. So I want to start, I'll move towards your president, but I want to discuss what I consider as the central secret of communism. Now that is not atom bomb spies or Occupy rock throwers. It is the ability of a tiny Marxist-Leninist party to get their policies implemented as the law of the land in their country. So how could this happen? How could a bunch of, a party maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 600 strong in a country with tens of millions of voters, how could they get their extreme policies adopted as legislation? Sound a little bit far-fetched? Well, I'd like to give you an example from my country, New Zealand. Back in 1984, we elected a socialist Labour government. And one of the very first things they did was to enact legislation banning nuclear warships from our harbours. Now, overnight, that destroyed the Australia, New Zealand, United States military alliance. ANZUS killed it stone cold dead because you guys were the only people sending warships to our harbours. So how would it happen in a country, a pro-Western, democratic country that loves America? How could we, at the height of the Cold War, turn our back on the Western alliance? Well, this is how it happened. Around that time, there were massive anti-nuclear marches throughout Europe. The Soviets were funding the European peace movement, big marches, anti-American marches, anti-nuclear marches, and people were genuinely worried that NATO would break up. And of course, the Soviets wanted that because that would give them dominance of Europe. So, to hasten this process, the Soviets decided to break away a country from the Western Alliance. And they're chess players, so they're very subtle. They picked on New Zealand because we were small, progressive, world leaders in progressive thought, and the communists were very strong, and our labour unions had infiltrated our Labour Party and controlled our peace movement. So around that time, I interviewed a New Zealander who had infiltrated the New Zealand Communist Party for our security services, our FBI. And in 1983, he was given the greatest honour any communist could enjoy. He was sent to Moscow to train at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning on Leningradsky Prospect. And this was not a small institute, this was a massive place. There were 7,000 students at any one time, many of them on 7-year courses, a lot of them with one-to-one tutelage. This was a training ground for the future world communist leadership. There were people there from Sri Lanka and the Philippines and Canada and Mexico and Jamaica and Korea and Luxembourg and Italy, Egypt, Tunisia. Virtually every country of the globe was represented except for one. And that was you guys, the United States. So why were no Americans there? Because at some point, your government had told the Soviets that were any Americans caught training at that institute, there would be war. And the Soviets respected that. But what they would do, they would train Canadians or Mexicans or New Zealanders in the doctrines they wanted promoted, and those people would go and train the American communists. So my friend sat down in a little room at the Institute with members of the KGB, the other 3 members of his delegation, and tutors from the Institute. And they wanted to work out how they could break away New Zealand from the Western Alliance. And they knew they couldn't sell it as an anti-American thing because New Zealanders loved America. They had to work it differently. They had to make it a patriotic thing of New Zealanders standing as an independent nation. So they worked out some slogans. You Kiwis standing against the nuclear arms race. Kiwis standing up for peace. Kiwis striking an independent foreign policy. All patriotic, chest-beating stuff. So they worked out the slogans, and this tiny delegation went back to New Zealand, had secret meetings with the Labour Party, with the labour unions, and the peace movement, they mounted a campaign, and a few short months that legislation was in front of the New Zealand Parliament, it was signed off, and our alliance with your country was killed stone cold dead. And I will tell you that if you ask any New Zealander today about our anti-nuclear stand, which is still in place, even the Conservatives don't dare to touch it, they will puff out their chest with pride and they'll say, yeah, we did it, we stood up for peace, we stood against the anti-nuclear, we stood against the nuclear arms race, and they'll be so proud. And not one New Zealander in 100,000 would have any idea that those policies were planned by the KGB at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning in Moscow. And the Soviets have done this kind of thing countless times across this planet. They're very, very good at it. So could this happen in your country, the land of the free? Most anti-communist country in the world, so we're told. Could it conceivably happen? Yeah. Okay, well I want to give you two examples. I'll give a little symbolic example first, out of California. Every year out there in the Golden State, they have a paid day off work to celebrate the life of Cesar Chavez, the Labour Union leader, founder of the United Farm Workers. Cesar Chavez, trained in Chicago by the communist agitator Saul Alinsky himself, worked with communists and socialists his entire life, and marched under the famous banner, "Se puede, yes we can." Heard that one before? Yeah. And Obama openly acknowledges where it came from. Two movements are locked. The woman who got that passed in California is Evelina Alarcon of the Cesar Chavez holiday campaign. And she got a whole bunch of left-wing movie stars and a whole bunch of Labour Union people and all her contacts in the California state legislature, and she got it pushed through. And now she's trying to do it nationwide, and her website proudly lists the endorsement for that campaign by Mr. Obama himself. But what most Californians probably don't realise, and I'm sure Mr. Obama wouldn't realise, was that Evelina Alarcon is the leader of the Southern California Communist Party USA. Surely Obama wouldn't know that. So that's a small example. What about a bigger example, one that's going to affect every single person here, one that will socialise between 1/6 and 1/4 of your economy if it's allowed to go through? What do you think that might be? Obamacare. Obamacare. The affordable, what a joke, the Affordable Health Care Act. Okay, now I know it's not fully socialised medicine yet, but we all know where it's going to go if it's allowed to stand. The private sector will be driven entirely out of healthcare. And you guys will not be customers of a private healthcare system, you will be liabilities of a state healthcare system. Big difference. So, the father of the socialised single-payer healthcare movement in this country is a man called Quentin Young. A retired medical doctor out of Chicago. He has pushed this idea for 50 years, set up numerous alliances, numerous front groups, worked with state legislatures all over the country, worked with congressmen like John Conyers to push his ideas. He's got legislation put forward on many occasions. It's always been voted down until 2009 when the Affordable Health Care Act went through. And it's no accident that the progress was made under Mr. Obama, because for many years Quentin Young was Barack Obama's personal physician. He openly claims credit for indoctrinating Obama into the ideas of socialised healthcare. But more than that, Quentin Young was a 40-year veteran of the Communist Party USA, until he left that organisation to set up a new Marxist group called Democratic Socialists of America, which is very, very strong in the Massachusetts state legislature. And that brings me to Romneycare, passed up the road there. According to an Obama campaign video, the man who designed Romneycare was a Harvard University academic and former Massachusetts state rep, John McDonough. And according to Obama, John McDonough was brought in to design Obamacare, brought in by the Senate to design the Affordable Health Care Act. What they don't tell you is that John McDonough was for many years the chair of Boston Democratic Socialists of America. So these Marxists are driving policy in your country all the time. All the time. And how they do it is pretty simple. The key is the labour unions. Because since 1995, when John Sweeney, a member of Democratic Socialists of America, took over as president of the AFL-CIO and abolished the anti-communist clause from that organisation, the Marxists have flooded back. And they now control every major labour union in this country. SEIU, ASCME, NEA, you name it, they run it. And it's very simple. The Marxists set a policy. They think, what do we want? What legislation do we want put forward? They set the policy, they make it labour union policy, because they control the labour unions. Then the labour unions go out and get Democrats elected. And there's hardly a Democrat in this country that isn't elected with labour union money and support. And he who pays the piper calls the tune. Communists set the policy, make it union policy, unions get the Democrats elected and tell the Democrats which legislation to put forward. If you want to know what the Democrats are going to do tomorrow, read the Communist Party USA's People's World Today or Democratic Socialists of America's Democratic Left, because what's in their pages today will be on the floor of your state legislature or on the floor of your Congress tomorrow. That is how they do it. Small groups of Marxists can control the legislative process in this country almost at will when the Democrats are in power. Moving on to your president. A lot of people say to me, Barack Obama made a great movement. I say the opposite. A great movement made Mr. Obama. And that movement really got underway in Hyde Park, Chicago in the 1950s. Now, South Chicago is a pretty bleak industrial area. There's a little green oasis in the middle of it, Hyde Park, very affluent area around the University of Chicago. And it's always been a rat's nest of leftists. In the 1950s, the Communist Party and the Socialist Party formed an alliance to take on the corrupt, daily Democratic Party machine that ran Chicago for decades. And they knew to do that, they had to broaden their base. So the Communists and the Socialists formed a big alliance with the blacks, the Latinos, and the labour unions of South Chicago. So Communists, Socialists, blacks, Latinos, and labour unions. Does that sound familiar to you guys? But that's where it started. And the first person they elected was a lawyer called Leon Dupre to the Chicago City Council. A real rebel he was, a big thorn in Daley's side. When he left the council, he became a mentor to Mr. Obama for many years. Very, very good friends they were. But back in the 1920s, Leon Dupre was going down to the local rifle range in Chicago with his best friend, Saul Alinsky, to practice target shooting, rifle shooting, for the communist revolution they believed was just around the corner. In the 1940s, Leon Dupre was going down to Mexico City to visit with Leon Trotsky, the exiled Soviet leader who was then hiding out from Stalin until Stalin got to him and had him assassinated. The next person these people elected was a man called Harold Washington. a black lawyer to the Chicago Mayoralty in 1983. And Washington was a long-time communist fronter, a Democratic Socialists of America affiliate, and he filled his administration from top to bottom with Marxists. Absolutely stacked it. And that lasted until he died in 1987 and the Daily Machine retook over. The next person on their list was a woman called Carol Moseley Brown. You might have heard of her. Yep, elected to the US Senate from Illinois in 1992. Long-time communist fronter, almost certainly a secret party member. Very corrupt though, only lasted one term. And then Mr. Clinton, President Clinton, gave her an ambassadorship, made her a representative of your country. And guess where he sent her? Way down to New Zealand. Great honour, thank you Mr. Clinton, a corrupt Chicago communist. The next person they elected was of course Mr. Obama himself to the Illinois State Senate. There's a story to that. Then in 2004, they got him elected to the US Senate from Illinois, and in 2008, by using those networks nationwide, they put him into the White House. And he who pays the piper calls the tune. Mr. Obama knows exactly who put him in power, and he's been fulfilling their agenda every day of his term of office. So why is Mr. Obama so happy to work with the old fossilised Marxists, the people we're all told had gone away? Well, really, that's his life. He really hasn't been exposed to any other point of view. He's always worked with them since he was a kid. And the very first significant mentor to Mr. Obama was, of course, Frank Marshall Davis. Now, Frank Marshall Davis really got started in Chicago in the 1940s. He was a Communist Party member of the Dory Miller Club of the Communist Party USA. He was a journalist, a writer, a poet, a jazz critic. He was very influential on the black left in Chicago at the time, which at the height of the jazz age was a very cool and hip movement to be part of. But in 1948, Frank Marshall Davis left all the glamour and glitz behind and moved out to a little backwater in Hawaii. And as Helen alluded, it was a territory then, it wasn't a state. The tourists hadn't really come, it was a backwater. But why would Frank Marshall Davis do that? Well, remember this, and Helen alluded to this. The number one target of the Soviets, and now the Russians, is what? What do you think it is? What have they always been targeting in your country? Wanting to destroy? Your military. Pearl Harbor. That's where Pearl Harbor was. And Stalin wanted as many spies as he could get on the islands and as many agitators as he could get to try and get those bases closed down. Because your military is the only thing that has ever stood in the way of those guys dominating this planet. The other thing that the communists were anticipating was, of course, Hawaiian statehood, because they knew that if they could take over the local Democrat Party, which they did, that would guarantee them control of that state's presidential or electoral college votes and give them 2 more left-wing senators and a whole bunch of left-wing congressmen in your government forever. Help keep you guys out of power. That is exactly the reason the communists have always backed the Washington DC statehood movement and the Puerto Rican statehood movement. Nothing to do with the rights of Washingtonians. It's just about getting more leftists into your Senate and Congress to keep you guys out. So Frank Marshall Davis was a loyal communist on the islands. He worked inside the Democrat Party, but he also worked for a labour union publication, the Honolulu Record. And his boss was a man called Koji Ariyoshi, Japanese-American communist, worked in China with the US Army in World War II with Mao Zedong's communist armies against the Japanese Imperial Army. After the war, Ariyoshi went to New York, where he worked with the Amerasia folk. Now the Amerasia people, Amerasia was a left-wing magazine staffed by communists and several, not one or two, but several known Soviet spies, and they were working with your State Department to tilt US foreign policy away from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese towards Mao Zedong's communist Chinese. And because they succeeded in betraying Chiang Kai-shek, 500 million Chinese were delivered to the communists. So Frank Marshall Davis, the FBI were watching him on the islands. They watched him for 19 years. He didn't flirt with communism. He was a communist for maybe 30 or 40 years. They compiled a 600-page file on the guy. And they even put him on Security Index A. Now that was reserved for only the most dangerous communists. And it meant that if war had ever broken out with the Soviet Union, Frank Marshall Davis could have been arrested that very day. Because the FBI were getting reports that Frank Marshall Davis was going out to beaches all around the Hawaiian Islands and photographing them with a camera with telescopic lenses. And I think they suspected espionage, military espionage. But anyway, this was the man that Stanley Dunham, about 1970, decided would be a great mentor for Mr. Obama, the young 10 or 11-year-old kid. The man who had written poems praising Stalin, poems praising the Red Army, poems viciously criticising racist KKK America. But this was the man that was going to guide Obama through his formative years. And Frank Marshall Davis was with Obama for 9 or 10 years. He's mentioned 22 times in Obama's book as a guide, a mentor, someone he turned to for advice. Never once, always as Frank, never once as Frank Marshall Davis. I wonder why that was. Was Mr. Obama protecting his privacy, I wonder? A lot of people say to me, a lot of liberals, they say, oh yeah, but by then, you know, Frank Marshall Davis, he was just a dope-smoking old alcoholic. No big deal. You know, nothing to see here. But by as late as 1979, the year Obama left for Occidental College, Frank Marshall Davis was still listed as an endorser of the American Committee for the Protection of Foreign-Born, the Communist Party USA's main front of the time. And two names below Frank Marshall Davis was listed another man, Hugh DeLacy. Hugh DeLacy. I'd like you to remember that for later in the talk. So Obama leaves Hawaii, goes to Occidental College in Los Angeles, mixes with Tom Hayden's radicals, mixes with the Democratic Socialist Alliance people on campus. And then he goes out to Columbia in New York. And while he was there, he attended at least one and possibly two of the annual Socialist Scholars Conferences that were then being organised by Democratic Socialists of America. These were not little events. These were 2,000 to 3,000 people gathered in Cooper Union. They were radical feminists, Marxist labour unionists, Black Panthers, foreign communists, you name it. 2,000 or 3,000 people gathered in a big hall plotting how to bring your country to its knees, and Mr. Obama was right in the midst of it. So then Obama goes out to Chicago, and the reason he is given for that, he was inspired by the election of the black Marxist mayor, Harold Washington. He even tried to get a job in Washington's administration. Didn't get that, but he still went to Chicago and worked with the radicals on the south side. Then Obama goes to Harvard, wanted a law degree. And while he was at Harvard, both Obama and Michelle were mentored by a man called Charles Ogletree, a law professor. They became great friends. Ogletree was a big champion of the communist Angela Davis, had been to Cuba as a young man, and was a former member of the Marxist-Leninist Black Panther Party. Just another one of Obama's mentors. So Obama comes back to Chicago. He's got his eyes set on politics. And the woman who got him his first job in politics is a lady called Alice Palmer, an Illinois state senator. And Obama and Alice Palmer worked together for several years. They're both involved with the Socialist New Party, set up by Democratic Socialists of America and ACORN and SEIU to move the Democratic Party left. But about 96, Alice Palmer decides to run for Congress. And she employed Obama as her chief of staff. And the deal was, Barack, you get me elected to Congress and you can take my state Senate seat. Very generous of her, I thought. As if it was her, like Ted Kennedy, you know, he owned his seat, of course. So, Alice Palmer took Obama around to meet all the people he had to know. It was Alice Palmer that took Mr. Obama to the famous meeting in the drawing room of Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dawn, the Weather Underground terrorists, in Hyde Park. Quentin Young, the doctor, was there at the same meeting. That was Obama's introduction to the Hyde Park left. But things don't always go smoothly in politics, and Alice Palmer didn't win her primary. So she said to Obama, look, sorry Barack, I want my state Senate seat back. And Barack says, no, sorry, tough Alice, I'm running. And he got her disqualified off the ballot by challenging her signatures, many of which were false. And he got the other three opponents disqualified the same way. So he ran unopposed. And that caused a big stink on the Chicago left. And a communist named Timuel Black, who was a friend of both Obama and Alice Palmer, was brought in to mediate. But that failed, and the two went their separate ways. But Alice Palmer is the woman who got your president his first job in politics, a guide and a mentor to him. But she had a bit of a history too. Back in 1980, she was invited by Maurice Bishop, the communist dictator of Grenada in the Caribbean, to the first anniversary celebrations of that country's Marxist-Leninist revolution. And the invitation cards are in my book, or copies of them. In 1983, when my friend was studying in Moscow, Maurice Bishop had been killed by some of his own more extreme comrades, and President Reagan sent troops onto the island to shut down what was going to become the second Cuba of the Caribbean. And I'll tell you what, the Soviets were absolutely spewing at what Reagan had done. They were absolutely, you know, livid about it. So we can thank Reagan for that one.
Yeah.
And for many other things. Yeah. But in 1983, Alice Palmer, same year, was over in Prague, in communist Czechoslovakia. And she was there for a meeting of the Soviet Front World Peace Council. And this is the theme of my talk. Soviets target your military. The World Peace Council was their #1 front worldwide. They put billions of rubles into it. When my friend John was studying in Moscow, one of the tutors of the institute, Comrade Venediev, said to him, John, there are many, many brilliant people in the Soviet Union, but nobody has yet been able to come up with a weapon as powerful as the peace movement. That is the emphasis they put on it, because their target was your military and the peace movement was their way of destroying it. So Alice Palmer was there at this organisation. They had affiliates all over the world. In New Zealand, we had the New Zealand Council for World Peace, which helped organise our anti-nuclear stand. And in the United States, you had and still have the US Peace Council. And Alice Palmer served on the National Executive of the US Peace Council alongside 16 members of the Communist Party USA. And a woman called Barbara Lee, who is now a Democrat congresswoman out of California. And when all the California Democrats were going for Hillary in 2008, guess who the first one was to come out for Mr. Obama? Barbara Lee. Running. Alice Palmer was also running the Black Press Institute out of Chicago. This was a network, a nationwide network of communist black journalists. It also had links to the Palestine Liberation Organization. And these guys were charged with sowing Soviet disinformation and propaganda amongst your country's black population. In 1985, Alice Palmer took 16 of these people to Czechoslovakia, East Germany and the Soviet Union, where they had meetings with all sorts of senior government officials and the editor of Pravda. In 1986, Alice Palmer covered that year's annual conference of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in Moscow. The same year, she was elected North American Vice President of the International Organization of Journalists, another bona fide Soviet KGB front. And her job was to monitor activities for the Soviets in Canada, the United States, the Caribbean and Mexico. And her job was to implement what they called their New Information Order. Very sinister sounding phrase. And that was all to do with what they called issues of media fairness. Media fairness. Who here remembers the Fairness Doctrine?
Yeah.
Fairness Doctrine. And I asked you to consider where that Fairness Doctrine probably came from, given that the Soviets were so keen to promote it. That was the idea that if you owned a radio station in this country and you had a conservative talkback host for a couple of hours in the afternoon, you had to give equal time to a liberal. Because it wasn't fair that the conservative would get an audience and readership and sponsorship while the poor dumb liberal sap got none of either. So they had to even it up for social justice on the airways. And it was only when Reagan abolished that conservative talkback became economic, and you had the Rush Limbaughs and the Sean Hannitys and the Glenn Becks and the beginnings of the movement that has, I'm sure, educated many of you people here. And just think about why Mr. Obama has talked about reintroducing a fairness doctrine and extending it to the internet through what he calls net neutrality.
Yeah.
Could it be that he wants to shut your voices down? Surely not. He wouldn't do that. So to put it bluntly, whether she knew it or not, and it's hard to imagine she doesn't, she's still alive, Alice Palmer was a high-level Soviet agent of influence. Right up there in the top, with contacts to the top levels of several Soviet bloc regimes and at least 2 major Soviet fronts. And this is the woman who got your president's first job. So Frank Marshall Davis, communist and possible Soviet spy, Alice Palmer, Democrat and definite Soviet agent of influence. So what about the president today, the company around him today? And I could go on all night about that, but I'll pick on 2 of them, the ones I consider most important. The first one is the other half of Obama's brain, Valerie Jarrett. Even the liberals call her that. Introduced Obama to his wife and now sits in the White House as his closest friend and most trusted advisor. I would say the most powerful woman in America. What about Valerie Jarrett's background? Where did she come from? Well, Valerie Jarrett's mother is Barbara Bowman, child psychologist out of Chicago, runs the Erickson Institute, which has had a lot of influence on early childhood education in your country. In 2009, President Obama gave Barbara Bowman an award for her work, and that ceremony was prominently featured in the pages of the Communist Party's People's World. Erik Erikson, the institute was named after Erik Erikson, an errant disciple of Sigmund Freud. Anybody here remember the phrase popular in the 60s, an identity crisis. He's having an identity crisis. Well, that was Erik Erikson. Now, he was kicked out of Berkeley as a professor in the 1940s because he refused to sign an anti-communist loyalty oath. He was a lecturer at the California Labor School, the Communist Party's main trade union school at the time. On the board of the Erikson Institute have served Tom Ayers, the father of Weather Underground terrorist Bill Ayers, and Bernadine Dawn, the wife of Bill Ayers and a famous terrorist in her own right. Valerie Jarrett's maternal grandfather, Robert Taylor, first black head of the Chicago Housing Authority. In 1940, he was an active leader of the Chicago local of the American Peace Mobilization. Don't they love that word, peace? And the job of that organization was to keep you guys out of World War II. Because American Peace Mobilization was a Communist Party front. And at that time, Hitler was overrunning Europe and about to conquer Britain, and the communists wanted him to do that. Why is that? Because the communists were then allies, the Soviet Union was then an ally of Nazi Germany. So the communists were working for a Nazi victory in Europe. They don't like to talk about that now. But in 1941, Hitler betrayed Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. And overnight, within 24 hours, American Peace Mobilization, they crossed out the middle word, became American People's Mobilization. The most pro-war, let's get the Nazis, let's beat Hitler organization in America. Beating the drums for war. Because the sacred Soviet Union was threatened. So they're all for peace when it suited the Soviets, and they're all for war when it didn't. And Robert Taylor, Valerie Jarrett's grandfather, was a key part of that, and he also served on the Chicago executive of the American Civil Liberties Union, another Communist Party front, and in both organisations he served with a man called Frank Marshall Davis. What about the other half of Valerie Jarrett's family? Her late father-in-law, Vernon Jarrett, a very prominent black Chicago journalist. When he died in 2004, and the last thing he did from his deathbed was to issue a call to the black population of South Chicago to get out and vote for Mr. Obama in that year's Senate primaries. Go back to 1946. Sure, there's nobody here that was born then, surely. Vernon Jarrett was then serving on the Illinois State Executive of American Youth for Democracy, a wonderful sounding organisation. Guess which political party it was the youth wing of? Communist Party USA. 1948, Vernon Jarrett was serving on the Publicity Committee of the Packing House Workers Strike Committee. Packing House workers were a communist union on strike, and Vernon Jarrett was writing their press releases and propaganda. And on that little publicity committee with Vernon Jarrett served Frank Marshall Davis. So isn't it interesting that these two people who run your country from the White House today can both trace their political lineage back to the Chicago Communist Party of the 1940s, and specifically to Mr. Frank Marshall Davis. Wouldn't read about it, would you? Except in there. So what about the other half of Mr. Obama's brain? Which doesn't leave a heck of a lot, really. And that's Mr. David Axelrod. David Axelrod, now sitting in Chicago, managing your president's hopefully unsuccessful re-election campaign. Now, David Axelrod wins his elections by blackening the name of his opponents. That's what he does. In 2004, he got some sealed divorce records released uncovered a sex scandal, and Mr. Ryan, who was standing against Mr. Obama, was out of the race. And I wonder why Mr. Romney has to deal with stories about gay haircuts when he was a teenager, his time with Bain Capital, his tax returns. We all know what's coming up with Mr. Ryan pushing Granny off the cliff and all this kind of stuff. That is how Axelrod wins. But where did he learn his trade? Well, when Mr. Axelrod came to Chicago in about 1972 to learn political science at the University of Chicago, he was picked up and mentored for several years by two very prominent Chicago journalists-activists, Don Rose and David S. Cantor. Now these guys worked with Mr. Axelrod for several years and got him his first job in journalism. They all worked together on the Carol Moseley Brown campaign and on the second Harold Washington campaigns. They were good buddies. But before that, both Cantor and Rose had been running a little publication out of Hyde Park, Chicago called the Hyde Park Kenwood Voices, and it was the voice of the Hyde Park left. It carried articles about Quinton Young's trip to North Vietnam during the Vietnam War to cut sugarcane for Castro. It carried articles about his son Ethan's trip to Cuba to cut sugarcane for Castro. It covered the SDS riots in Chicago in 1968 on the side of the rioters. And it had a regular column by a man called Abner Mikva, local congressman. He was a big part of their apparatus. Mikva in Congress was a huge opponent of your Second Amendment. He campaigned relentlessly against gun rights. When he left Congress, he was a law professor at the University of Chicago. He became an open supporter of Democratic Socialists of America. He also mentored for several years your president, Mr. Obama, yet another one. He also mentored another very well-known American lawyer, I'm sure you've all heard of her, Elena Kagan, now serves on your Supreme Court. So Don Rose, Communist Party fronter since the 1940s. Chicago Police Squad file describes him as a dangerous anarchist. He was a long-time executive member with Timur Black and Quinton Young of the Chicago Committee to Defend the Bill of Rights. Wonderful organisation, eh? Main Communist Party front in Chicago. 1968, Don Rose coined the famous phrase, "The whole world is watching," during the riots of Chicago, which Don Rose helped to organise. Excuse me. The other half of the partnership, David Cantor. His father was a man called Harry Cantor. In the 1930s, he headed the Massachusetts Communist Party. And after a year in jail for sedition, in 1932, he took his whole family, including baby David, to the Soviet Union for 5 years. Got a personal audience with Stalin. Was given a job translating Lenin's works from Russian into English. That is a great honour. In the 1940s, both Harry and David Cantor were living in Chicago, both active members of the Communist Party. In 1948, Harry Cantor and some other communists bought a little communist publication called the Chicago Star of its owner because he was leaving town. He was going out to Hawaii. Guess who that was? Frank Marshall Davis. Go forward to 1960. David Cantor was running a little publication company in Chicago called Transworld Publications, and his partner was a man called Leroy Wolland, another communist who went on to found Veterans for Peace, yet another anti-military Communist Party front. These two guys were getting a regular subsidy from the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C. to distribute communist literature all over your country. The two men were required to register by your government as agents of the Soviet Union. Go forward to 1964. Anybody here remember the famous race between Barry Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson?
Yeah.
Big presidential battle. Very crucial race in the history of this country. Now Lyndon Johnson, the Democrat, won. We've got the Great Society, the biggest expansion of welfareism and federal power since the New Deal. Put millions of families in this country on welfare and destroyed communities across your country. The other guy, Barry Goldwater, was a conservative Republican, a constitutionalist and a patriot. He would have loved the Tea Party and the Tea Party would have loved him.
Yes.
He's a great man. But he didn't win. And one of the main reasons he didn't, he was viciously vilified in the press of your country as a racist, a fascist, and an extremist. Anybody here heard those terms in recent times?
Oh, yeah.
Vaguely familiar to you guys?
A couple of times.
It's no accident. One of the main sources, one of the very main sources of the vilification of Barry Goldwater was Transworld Publications out of Chicago. Soviet-subsidised and communist-run publication company of David Cantor. So your Mr. Axelrod got his training at the hands of a Soviet-paid, communist, professional, black propagandist and character assassin. So you wonder why Mr. Axelrod behaves the way he does. So that brings me to what I consider is the real agenda of the left in this country. What do they want? What do they want for you guys? You know, do they want to make you like France or Europe, as some people will tell you? Is that all they want? I'm going to say what I think their agenda is, and I've already hinted at it. But before I do that, I want to build up a little bit of credibility for a retired Albuquerque high school math teacher named Mark Rudd. Now, why would I want to do that? Who's Mark Rudd? Mark Rudd was the brains of the Weather Underground terrorist organisation. Right up there in the top leadership with Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dawn. Hi, John. In 1968, Mark Rudd led the famous SDS riots at Columbia University, which made headlines across the world. In 1969, he was in Cuba training under a KGB major. In 2006, in Chicago, where else? Mark Rudd and Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dawn and Jeff Jones, also a Weather Underground leader, who incidentally helped write Obama's stimulus package, got together with Tom Hayden and Angela Davis and David Graeber, one of the founders of the Occupy movement, and a whole bunch of communists and socialists, and set up a new radical organisation, Movement for a Democratic Society. Wonderful name, eh? That was the adult support network for the new SDS, the new student radicals on campuses across your country. The people who attacked the Republican Party convention in Minneapolis a few years ago. But in 2008, MDS spawned another organisation, an offshoot, headed by Tom Hayden and two members of Democratic Socialists of America, Barbara Ehrenreich and Bill Fletcher, and they called this one Progressives for Obama. And Mark Rudd endorsed that organisation. So what I'm trying to say here is that Mark Rudd is a key member of the US left, and he personally knows people who know Obama and have worked with him for many, many years. So when he predicts Obama's agenda and says where he is taking this country, I will listen to him. Now in 2008, November, just after the election, President-elect Obama appointed some conservatives to positions in your defence establishment. And some conservatives breathed a big sigh of relief thinking, wow, maybe he's not such a radical after all. But the left were absolutely spewing. They were livid. And Mark Rudd's inbox was filling up with irate emails from comrades all over the country. What the hell is our man doing putting conservatives into the military-industrial complex? And Mark Rudd knew he had to settle the comrades down, get them back on board with the president. So he wrote a little article for the Rag blog out of Texas, November 28, 2008, still online, very widely read on the left, and he called it, "Let's Get Smart About Obama." And this is some of what he said. Obama is a very strategic thinker. He knew precisely what it would take to get elected, and he didn't blow it. He knew he had to play to the centre to not be run over by the press, the Republicans, or to scare centrist voters. And he made it. So he has a narrow mandate for change. The economic agenda will stress stimulus from the bottom at some times and handouts to the top at others. Because that's what happened. And never threaten the military budget. That will unite a huge majority of Congress against them. And I agree with this strategy. Leave the military alone because they are way too powerful for now. By the second or third year of this recession, people may begin to discuss cutting the military budget. So where are we now, ladies and gentlemen? 3 years in, right? You're worried about your jobs, your businesses, paying the IRS, keeping your kids in college. America is focused on the economic issues. And while you're all looking there, and who can blame you, what is smiling Leon Panetta doing over your Department of Defence? Slashing it to ribbons. Even when he protests about it, he's still doing it. 20% of US federal spending is taking more than 50% of the cuts. Whole weapon systems, 50,000 troops. The cream of your military, mid-level officers, whole divisions, everywhere it's going. Barack Obama has even proposed cutting your US nuclear arsenal down to 292 nukes. When the Russians have thousands of them, and the best civil defence system in the world. And who do you think is cheering this on? Who do you think stands to gain from all of this? Who's been funding your peace movement for decades? Which is the country that Mitt Romney recently correctly identified as this country's #1 geopolitical foe? Russia. And their Chinese and Iranian allies, and they're all allied in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and their Venezuelan friends, and their North Korean friends, and their Cuban friends. They are the people who've been funding your peace movement for decades. And now, guess what? They're getting everything they want. And what was Mr. Obama doing in Korea just a few months ago, in an off-mic situation, talking to the Russian president about missile defense? When I get re-elected, I will have more flexibility to deal with you. You need to give me some space. And Medvedev says, yes, I understand. I will pass your message on to Vladimir. We are with you. That is the single most significant thing your president has ever said. Because that is the agenda of the left. They don't care about your economy or your liberty. They want your military. Because if they can destroy that, what is going to stop them taking over the whole planet? You tell me. The Canadians? Iceland? Australia and New Zealand? This is a serious situation, folks. Because this is affecting all of us. And you imagine this, if Obama gets in for another 4 years, how much military are you going to have left? How effective is it going to be? So this isn't about a recession, because you guys can survive a recession. This isn't about losing some of your rights, because you're Americans and you'll stand up and take them back. But have you ever been in the position before when your Commander-in-Chief and your Secretary of Defence are basically giving your number one enemy everything it wants? So Mark Rudd hadn't quite finished. He went on to say, I'm not much of an athlete. No, he said, Obama plays basketball. I'm not much of an athlete. I barely know the game. But one thing I do know is that you have to be able to look like you're doing one thing, but do another. That is why all these conservative appointments are important. The strategy is to feint right, move left. Any other strategy invites sure defeat. So is not that an admission by Mr. Rudd that his president scammed his way into the White House by pretending to be a moderate, but his agenda has always been left? And he has got your military as his number one target. Is that serious, folks? Yeah, I think so. That brings me to smiling Leon himself. Voted in 100-0 through your Senate. 100-0. Not one of them bothered to check the man's credentials. Not one of them. Leon Panetta, Democrat congressman out of Santa Cruz, California for many years. The Santa Cruz Democrat Party is not like, you know, the Idaho Democrat Party or the Nebraska Democrat Party. It is the far left, lunatic fringe, nutcase California Democrat Party. A bit like the Massachusetts and maybe the Rhode Island Democrat Party.
Amen.
Leon Panetta had members of Democratic Socialists of America on his campaign committees. He put tributes to communist peace activists into the congressional record. He campaigned to get Leonard Peltier, an American Indian activist who murdered 2 FBI agents in North Dakota, out of jail. He spent most of his time in Congress criticising Reagan's Star Wars proposals, campaigning to stop Reagan fighting the communists in Latin America, and campaigning to cut US military spending. He was a left-wing, anti-military Democrat. That's what he was. And everybody knew it. The man has 2 years military experience, but he was a White House budget director under Clinton, who also happened to cut your military. His job is to cut your military to ribbons while smiling and keeping the Republicans and the public on board. But Leon Panetta also had some little friends. Leon and Sylvia Panetta had some friends in Santa Cruz. Leon and Sylvia were best friends with Hugh and Dorothy. Hugh and Dorothy DeLacy. Hugh DeLacy of the American Committee for the Protection of Foreign-Born. Now these two people, these couples had parties at each other's houses. They were best buddies. When Hugh DeLacy died in 1986, Leon Panetta read the eulogy to him. There were 4 people who read a eulogy to the man at the Loudon Nelson Center in Santa Cruz. Leon Panetta and 3 members of Democratic Socialists of America. Hugh DeLacy and Leon Panetta had a series of letters going back and forward for 9 or 10 years, and I've got them all. And they're all about how terrible Star Wars was, how they needed to cut US military spending, and how Reagan should not be opposing the Nicaraguan Sandinista communists. That's what they're all about. And Leon Panetta should have known that his best buddy, Hugh DeLacy, was going down to Nicaragua to visit with those communist Sandinistas, and was going to Spain to visit with the Spanish Communist Party. Didn't seem to worry him though. Go back, but Hugh DeLacy had a little bit of a history. 1946 to 1948, He was a Democratic congressman out of Washington State, Seattle area. And that was the time they used to talk about the 47 states of the Union and the Soviet of Washington. Communists ran the state. And Hugh DeLacy spent most of his time in Congress agitating for the United States to abandon Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese and support Mao Zedong's communist Chinese. And it's not surprising he did that, because all the time he was in Congress and right up until at least the early 1970s, he was a secret card-carrying member of the Communist Party USA. And that's not me saying that, that's a generally known historical fact now. So he was a communist. In 1975, just before the correspondence started with Panetta, Hugh DeLacy was contacted by an old friend from the 1940s, a Stanford University academic named John Stewart Service. And these guys had worked together on Chinese issues back in the 40s. John Stewart Service just happened to be a member, a Soviet spy, a member of the Amerasia Soviet spy ring. And he arranged for Hugh and Dorothy DeLacy to get a free, month-long, all-expenses-paid trip to Communist China on the dime of the Chinese Communist Party. And while they were there, Hugh and Dorothy DeLacy had time to visit with two American expatriates. The first was Frank Coe, then working as a propagandist for the communist government. Frank Coe was a former Soviet spy, member of the Amerasia spy ring. The other guy they met with was Solomon Adler, another Soviet spy, former member of the Amerasia spy ring. And he was at that time a serving advisor to the Chinese intelligence services, a live Chinese spy. Back in the United States, Hugh DeLacy was also corresponding with Don Wheeler, communist out of Washington State, a former member of the Silver Master KGB spy ring of Washington DC in the 1940s. Also corresponding with Victor Turlow out of Connecticut, whose daughter-in-law happens to be great friends of Rosa DeLauro, incidentally, another former member of the Silver Master KGB spy ring. So Mr. Panetta, Mr. DeLacy, who is best friends for many years of your current Secretary of Defence, personally knew 5 former Soviet spies, one of whom was still a live Chinese agent. Now, if Mr. Panetta, or Mr. Obama for that matter, applied for a job as a janitor at your nearest military base and had to get an FBI clearance, how do you think he'd get on?